The truck came at 7 in the morning, and it did not slow down. Ruth Ann Beckert was standing at her kitchen window, with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, yet when she heard the air brakes out past the tree line, she set the cup down. She went out onto the back step in her housecoat in March in Tennessee, and she watched a dump truck back across the strip of ground, where her fence used to be, before the spring floods took it. The bed went up, for tons of cedar scrap came down. Then the driver pulled forward, swung wide through her turnaround, and left. He never got out of the cab. He never looked at the house. Ruth Ann was 63 years old. Her husband had been dead almost 2 years. The life insurance had gone to the hospital in Nashville, every dollar of it, and there was $40 in her checking account and a truck out front with a cracked windshield. She stood there a long while. Then she walked down off the step, out across the wet grass in her house shoes, and she picked up one of those thin, pale strips of wood. She turned it over. She held it up to her face. And Ruth Ann Beckert, who had spent 27 years under a lamp inspecting wool, smelled it. That pile was garbage. The company 9 miles up the road was paying $8,000 a year to bury it in a hole in the ground. 12 years later, she bought every board foot they had left. Here is the thing about that smell. Most people would say cedar and think of a hope chest, a grandmother's attic, something folded in tissue paper that nobody's worn since 1962. Warm, sweet, a little sharp underneath, like the inside of a pencil box. That's what most people would think. Ruth Ann thought something else. She thought about a wool coat, a camel hair, 3/4 length, that a woman had brought into the mill in the spring of 1994, with 4 holes chewed through the left shoulder, and the woman had been crying, and Ruth Ann had taken the coat under the lamp and turned it and said, "That's not a snag, honey, that's larvae. Look at the edges, see how they're fuzzy instead of clean." 27 years of that. 27 years of standing under a lamp, with a magnifier, and other people's ruined clothing, and telling them what had eaten it. So when Ruth Ann Beckert held that strip of cedar up to her face on a cold Tuesday morning in March of 2009, she was not thinking about hope chests. She was thinking, this is the smell that stops it. And then, immediately after, because she couldn't help it, because her brain had been doing this for 4 decades. Why in God's name is 4 tons of it lying in my backyard? Let's back up. Because you don't understand what happened in that yard unless you understand who was standing in it. Ruth Ann was born in February of 1946, in a house 9 miles outside Marlow Bend, Tennessee, the third of 5, and the only girl. Her father cut timber. Her mother took in sewing. There was a kerosene lamp in that house until Ruth Ann was 7 years old, and she could still remember the exact sound the mantle made when it caught. She married Carl Beckert in 1966. He was 22. She was 20. He worked for the county road department for 38 years, and he was, by every account including his wife's, the quietest man in Caldwell County. Not cold, quiet. There is a difference, and Ruth Ann spent 41 years learning it. Carl didn't say "I love you." Carl fixed the porch step before you noticed it was loose. Carl warmed up your truck on cold mornings, without being asked, and without mentioning it afterward. Carl, when you told him something important, would go silent for so long that you'd think he hadn't heard, and then 2 weeks later he'd hand you the thing you needed and say nothing at all. His phrase, the one Ruth Ann would hear in her head for the rest of her life, was "let me think on it." That meant yes. It never once meant no. She went to work at the Marlow Bend textile mill in 1978, when Corinne started first grade, and the house got quiet during the day, and Ruth Ann discovered she did not like quiet as much as she had expected to. She started in packing, moved to inspection in 1981. An inspection, if you've never done it, is not a job most people would want. You stand at a table under a bank of fluorescent lights for 8 hours, and you look at fabric. That's it. You look at fabric and you find what's wrong with it. Broken picks, slubs, dye streaks a quarter shade off that nobody would catch in a store, but that would show up under a customer's kitchen window and generate a return. You find the flaw. That's the whole job. Most people burn out in 2 years. Ruth Ann did it for 27. Because, and she would never have said this out loud, Not to Carl, not to anybody. She was good at it. Extraordinarily good. There was a rhythm to it that other people never found, a way of letting your eye go soft and wide across the whole bolt instead of hunting inch by inch, so that the flaw came to you instead of you going to it. She trained 11 inspectors. 9 of them quit. The mill closed in 2008. Not with a speech. Not with a ceremony. A letter in the pay envelope on a Friday in August, 60 days notice, and a job fair in the parking lot that 4 employers attended, and 3 of them were staffing agencies. Ruth Ann was 62 years old and had one skill, and it was a skill that no longer existed anywhere within 120 miles. And Carl had been dead 16 months by then. Pancreatic. Diagnosed in January of 2007. Gone by the 3rd week of May. For months. That's the whole story of it. Really. For months, and a hospital in Nashville, and a hallway with a vending machine that Ruth Ann came to know better than she knew some of her own relatives. She sat with him. She read to him. When he stopped being able to follow the reading, she just talked about the mill, about the neighbors, about nothing, because the nurse had said hearing goes last, and Ruth Ann was not going to let that man lie in a quiet room. 41 years of him being quiet. She figured she owed him some noise at the end. The last thing Carl Beckert said to her on a Tuesday afternoon, out of nowhere, after 4 hours of not speaking at all, was, "You're going to get bored, Ruthie." She said, "What?" He said, "Just don't sit." And then he slept, and then he didn't wake up, and the life insurance policy paid out $61,000, and the hospital took $58,400 of it, and Ruth Ann Beckert came home to a house that was, for the first time since 1966, completely silent. She sat. For about a year and a half she sat. Not in a dramatic way. She wasn't in a chair staring at a wall. She cooked. She went to church. She kept the yard. She drove into town once a week for groceries, and she was polite to everyone, and she looked, from the outside, exactly like a woman managing. But the evenings. God, the evenings. Because here's what nobody tells you about being widowed at 61. Everybody's ready for the funeral. Everybody brings a casserole. The casseroles keep coming for 3 weeks, and then they stop all at once like somebody flipped a switch, and what's left is a Tuesday in October at 6:40 in the evening, and there is nothing. No sound. Nobody to tell about the thing that happened at the store. You start narrating out loud to an empty kitchen, and then you catch yourself doing it. And then you feel foolish, and then you stop. That's the part. That's the part that gets people. So in the fall of 2008, 3 months after the mill closed and 16 months after Carl died, Ruth Ann Beckert did a thing she never told a single soul about until much later. She signed up for a night class at the community college. Not to change careers. Let's be clear about that, because people got it wrong later, and it annoyed her. She wasn't reinventing herself. She was 62 years old and unemployed, and she needed somewhere to be on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. That wasn't her kitchen. That's it. That was the whole plan. The class was called Materials and Their Properties. She picked it because it met at 7 and because the description mentioned wood and fiber, and she figured she'd at least understand half of it. The instructor was a woman named Dr. Imani Ofori, mid-40s, trained somewhere far away, and teaching in a community college classroom in Caldwell County, Tennessee, for reasons Ruth Ann never learned and never asked about. She had a way of standing very still while she talked. She wore reading glasses on a chain, and she never once, in a room with 19 students, talked down to any of them. There were 4 people over 50 in that class. 3 of them dropped by October. Ruth Ann sat in the 2nd row. The assignment came in the 3rd week. 10 pages. Pick a domestic wood species and write on its historic uses. Ruth Ann picked eastern red cedar because there was a stand of it behind her house, and because she'd had a cedar chest at the foot of her bed since 1966. She drove to the county library on a Saturday and did not leave until it closed. And here is where the thing happened. Because she found a page in a bulletin from the 1930s, an agricultural extension pamphlet somebody had bound into a volume nobody had checked out since 1971, and the page was about clothes moths. Tiniola bisiliella, the webbing clothes moth, the exact insect Ruth Ann Beckert had been identifying under a magnifier for 27 years. And the page said that eastern red cedar contains aromatic compounds, cedral chief among them, and that those compounds move through the air in an enclosed space, and that they kill the larvae. Not repellent in the way a mothball is repellent. Lethal. To the young ones. The ones actually doing the eating. And then there was one more line, almost an afterthought, at the bottom of the page. It said, "The effect depends on the wood being exposed. Finished or sealed cedar loses its function." Ruth Ann read that line. Then she read it again. Then she sat back in a plastic library chair and said, out loud to nobody, "The smell is the thing." She turned in 34 pages. The assignment was 10. She wasn't showing off. She physically could not stop. She'd write a section and then think of something else, and then there'd be a fourth cup of coffee, and it would be 1 in the morning, and the house would be quiet, and she wouldn't have noticed the quiet for 6 straight hours. That was the part she couldn't have explained to anybody. Dr. Ofori handed it back 2 weeks later, face down, the way she did with everybody. Ruth Ann turned it over. At the top, in green pen, "This is more than I asked for. It is also better than I expected. Don't stop." Ruth Ann Beckert, 62 years old, sat in a community college classroom in a folding desk built for a 19-year-old, and had to look at the ceiling for a second. For months later, a dump truck backed across her fence line. She didn't call anybody. That's the first thing you should know about how Ruth Ann handled it. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't call the mill. She didn't call Corinne in Nashville, which, well, we'll get to Corinne. She went inside. She put on real clothes. She got a notebook off the shelf above the washer, a spiral-bound one, and she took a pencil and went back out there and started counting. Because she wanted to know how much. For tons is a number that doesn't mean anything until you make it mean something. So she measured the pile. She measured a single slat. She weighed a bundle of them on the bathroom scale twice and averaged it. It took her most of the morning, and she got cedar dust in her hair, and at 11:30 she went in and washed her hands and wrote a number in the notebook and looked at it. Then she drove to the Cavanaugh Pencil Company. Cavanaugh had been making pencils in Caldwell County since 1911. Eastern red cedar almost exclusively, because red cedar sharpens clean and holds a point and doesn't splinter when a second grader chews on it. They cut billets into slats, thin, precise, about 7 inches by 3.5, kiln-dried, and grooved them and glued them in pairs around a graphite core, and that was a pencil. But you don't get a perfect slat every time. You get pieces too narrow, too short, split along the grain, knotted, off dimension by 1/16 of an inch, which for a pencil is a catastrophe, and for anything else on God's earth is nothing at all. Those went in a bin. The bin went in a dumpster. The dumpster went to a landfill in the next county over. The plant manager was a man named Emmett Pryor. 60 years old, 22 years at Cavanaugh, and he had the specific expression of a man who has spent 2 decades solving other people's problems, and would very much like today to not be another one. He came out to the front office, because the girl at the desk said there was a lady asking about the scrap. He said, "Ma'am?" Ruth Ann said, "Somebody dumped 4 tons of your cedar on my property line." Emmett Pryor closed his eyes for about 1.5 seconds. Then he said, "Yeah, that's it. That's what he said." Yeah. Because it wasn't a surprise. Because it had been happening for a while. Because there was a stretch of low ground out past the back fence that the drivers had been using as an unofficial dump for years, and nobody had ever come in to complain about it. And the reason nobody had ever come in to complain about it was that until the floods of 2007 there had been a fence there, and everybody had assumed it was mill property. He said, "I'll get a crew out there this week." And Ruth Ann said the sentence that changed everything. She said, "What does it cost you?" Emmett Pryor blinked. "Ma'am, to haul it. What does it cost you a year?" "To the scrap." The scrap. He stood there. He genuinely did not understand why she was asking. He looked at the door and then back at her, and then he said, 8,000. Give or take. Tipping fees and the hauler. A year. A year. Ruth Ann said, "Thank you," and wrote something in her notebook, and left. Emmett Pryor stood in his own front office for a good 10 seconds, after the door shut. Then he went back to work, and did not think about it again for 11 months. She drove home on the county road, with her hands at 10 and 2. And her brain would not shut up. $8,000 a year. To throw away. To throw away the thing. To throw away the one thing that... No, wait, stop. You're 63. 63 and you have $40 and you're what? What exactly? You're going to do what, Ruth? And you don't own a saw. You don't own a saw. She pulled into her own driveway and turned off the truck and sat there with her hands still on the wheel. And out the windshield, across the yard, past where the fence used to be, there was 8 feet of pale gold cedar in a pile 30 feet wide, and the sun had come out and you could smell it from inside the cab with the windows up. She said, out loud, "Well, that's ridiculous." And then she got out and went and got a tape measure. Now, the thing Ruth Ann understood, the thing that made her different from every single person who had ever driven past that pile and seen garbage, was not that cedar repels moths. Everybody's grandmother knows that. What she understood was the closet. Because think about it. Really think about it. If you've got a closet in your house right now, what's it made of? Painted drywall. Maybe a wire shelf. Maybe one of those laminate systems from the home store, the particle board kind with the melamine skin that starts peeling at the corner in year 3. And what's in it? Your wool coat. Your good sweaters. The suit your husband was buried in and the one you kept. Blankets. Your mother's quilt. Everything you own that is made of an animal fiber, which is everything a clothes moth on this earth wants to eat. The hope chest solved this. For 150 years the hope chest solved this. Small sealed cedar box, concentrated vapor, nothing gets in. And then, sometime around 1975, America stopped using hope chests. But it did not stop buying wool. So there is a nation of houses full of closets that organize clothing beautifully and protect it not one bit. And there are mills across this country paying money to throw away the exact material that would fix it. Ruth Ann wrote that in her notebook on the night of March 17, 2009. Then, underneath it, in her small square handwriting, she wrote, "It's not storage, it's preservation." And she underlined it twice. She needed a saw. She had $40. You see the problem. What she did about it is the part of this story that made a certain kind of person in Caldwell County uncomfortable for years afterward. And I want you to hear it plain. She sold her wedding china. Not Carl's tools. Not the truck. Not the rings, never the rings. She wore those until the day she died. The china, 12 place settings, given to them in 1966 by Carl's aunt, used maybe 9 times in 41 years, sitting in a cabinet in a dining room where nobody had eaten a meal since May of 2007. She got $310 for it at an estate dealer in town. She bought a used table saw for $240 and a router with a chipped fence for $55. And she had $15 left, and she bought a package of sandpaper and a spiral notebook and a pencil. She never told Corinne about the china. Corinne found out in 2013, and it did not go well. She set up in Carl's shed. It was a 20 by 30 pole building he'd put up in 1988, and it still had his workbench in it, and his coffee can of drill bits and a hook by the door, where his jacket had been hanging for 22 months, because Ruth Ann had not been able to make herself take it down. She stood in the doorway the first morning, with an extension cord in her hand, looked at the jacket, looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "You said don't sit." And she moved it to the nail by the window and plugged in the saw. The first 2 weeks were a catastrophe. She wants that in the record because she could not stand the version where a woman just naturally knows things. She ruined about 140 slats. She burned out a router bit in 9 minutes. She cut a tongue and groove joint that was so wrong she kept it on the wall for the next 15 years as a reminder, and she nearly took the tip off her left index finger on the 4th day, and drove herself to the urgent care with a dish towel wrapped around her hand, and told them she'd done it opening a can. Then she went home and did it again. Because, and this is the part people don't understand about a woman, who spent 27 years finding flaws in fabric, she was not discouraged by failure. Failure was her entire professional expertise. Her whole career was walking up to a thing and identifying precisely what was wrong with it and why. Turn that around and point it at your own work, and you have something most people never develop in their lives. By the end of week 3 she had a system. Sort by width. Sort by grain. Alternate the narrow and the wide, so the variation in the scrap becomes a pattern instead of a defect. Sand to 150, then 220, and then nothing. No stain, no lacquer, no poly, nothing. She wrote it on an index card and taped it above the sander. No finish. The smell is the product. That card stayed on that wall for 4 years. Remember it. The first customer was a woman named Wilma Sharpe, 74 years old, widowed since 1998, lived in a 2-story on Depot Street, with a wraparound porch and a magnolia her husband planted in 1961. She had a cedar chest that had belonged to her mother, and she had, in the upstairs hall closet, a wool coat with a hole in the sleeve, a cashmere cardigan, with 2 holes in the front, and a stole that had belonged to her grandmother, that she had not been able to look at, since she opened the bag it was in. She had gotten Ruth Ann's name from a woman at church. Ruth Ann drove over on a Thursday in June and stood in that closet with a flashlight and a tape measure. 7 feet tall. For wide. 8 deep. 1 shelf, 1 rod, painted drywall going gray at the baseboard. Wilma said, "Can you do anything with it?" Ruth Ann said, "Yes, ma'am." She had never done one in her life. She measured it 3 times. She drew it on graph paper at her kitchen table with a ruler and a pencil, erased it, drew it again. Counted slats. Counted them again because she'd counted wrong. Took her 9 days. 9 days working alone in a stranger's upstairs hallway, on her knees on a drop cloth at 63 years old with a knee that had been bad since 1991. And when she was done, the walls and the ceiling and the back and the shelving were all eastern red cedar, alternating narrow and wide, sanded to 220, and finished with absolutely nothing. Wilma Sharpe opened the door, and she stopped. She just stopped, standing in her own hallway, because it hits you. That's the thing about it. It's not a nice smell exactly. It's a specific smell, and it goes past your nose and straight into some part of your brain that stores 1958, and Wilma Sharpe stood in her upstairs hallway on a Tuesday in July, with her hand on the doorframe, and did not say anything for about 15 seconds. Then she said, "Oh," and then she said, "Oh, my mother's house," and she cried, which neither of them had planned on. Ruth Ann charged her $1,200. Her material cost was $47. Screws, construction adhesive, 2 tubes of it, and a new blade. The cedar was free. The cedar was free because a company 9 miles away was paying $8,000 a year to bury it in a hole in the next county. She wrote the numbers in the notebook that night. 1,200, 47. And she looked at that for a while at her kitchen table alone with the light on over the stove. And then she wrote underneath, 9 days is too long. Because that's who she was. Wilma Sharpe told 2 women at church. Those 2 told for more. By December of 2009, Ruth Ann Beckert had done 9 closets and cleared a little over $11,000. Now, Corinne Beckert was 37 years old in 2009, lived in Nashville, worked in medical billing, and had not had a real conversation with her mother since the day of the funeral. That's not a fight. There was no fight. It's worse than a fight, honestly, because a fight you can point at. What happened was this. Carl died, and Corinne came home for 4 days, and on the 3rd day she found her mother in the kitchen at 11 at night reorganizing a drawer of dish towels. Alphabetizing them, essentially, by color. And Corinne said, "Mom, stop." And Ruth Ann said, "I'm fine." And Corinne said, "You're not fine, you're..." And Ruth Ann said, "I'm fine, Corinne." In a voice she had never once used on her daughter in 35 years. Corinne went back to Nashville the next morning. They talked on the phone after that. Sundays. 11 minutes, more or less. Weather, work, the neighbor's dog. 2 women who loved each other enormously and had absolutely no idea how to say one true thing. So when Ruth Ann started building closets, she did not mention it. For 14 months, she did not mention it. She would have told you it was because it wasn't important yet. That she'd tell her when there was something to tell. That wasn't the reason. The reason was that she was 63 years old and unemployed, and she had sold her wedding china for a table saw, and somewhere down in a place she did not look at directly, she was afraid that her own daughter would laugh at her. Somebody else got there first. The Caldwell County Home and Garden Show was held in April of 2010 at the fairgrounds, in a metal building with concrete floors and terrible acoustics, and Ruth Ann rented a 10-foot booth for $175 that she absolutely could not spare. She brought a folding table from the church basement, a photo album of her 9 closets, a sample panel, 2 feet by 3, cedar, alternating narrow and wide, sanded and unfinished. And her notebook open because she'd been doing figures while she waited. She wore a flannel shirt because she'd been in the shop that morning. She was 64 years old. Dale Renfrow walked past her booth twice before he stopped. He was 58. He'd run Renfrow Home Solutions out of a showroom on Madison Street since 1991. Laminate closet systems, mostly out of a distributor in Nashville. He knew every realtor in the county. He knew every flipper for 60 miles. His sign said Caldwell County's closet expert since 1991. He had never had a competitor. He'd heard about her. That's why he walked past twice. He'd heard from a contractor that some woman out past Marlow Bend was lining closets with pencil scrap, and he had come to that show specifically to look at it, and he had walked past twice because he was working out what he wanted to say. He stopped on the third pass. He picked up the sample panel, turned it over, ran a thumb along the edge. He said, "Huh." Then he set it down and looked at her, at the flannel shirt, at the church table, at the photo album from the drugstore, at the notebook with the columns of pencil figures, and there were 2 contractors standing right there with coffee cups. And Dale Renfrow smiled. Not a mean smile. That's the thing. It would be easier if it were a mean smile. It was a patient one. And he said, "Now that's cute. Beat. Sweetheart, at your age? Call it a hobby. Don't call it a business." The 2 contractors laughed. Not cruelly. Just automatically. The way men laugh at a thing the loudest man in the group has decided is funny, before anybody's checked whether it is. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. That's how long it lasted. Ruth Ann Beckert did not say a word. She did not defend herself. She did not explain the cedral. She did not say, "I inspected wool for 27 years. She did not say, "I did 9 closets last year, and one of my customers cried." She looked at Dale Renfrow. Then she looked down at her notebook, and she wrote something. Right there, in front of him, 4 words in that small square handwriting, and then she put the pencil down and lined it up parallel to the edge of the notebook, which is a thing she did. And she looked back up at him, and she said, "All right, that's all. All right." And it was somehow so much worse than anything else she could have said, that Dale Renfrow felt his own face get warm, and he did not know why, and he covered it by saying something about the weather and moving on down the aisle. That "at your age" is the part that did the damage. Not the sweetheart, because Ruth Ann Beckert had been managing something for 2 years that nobody around her had noticed. She'd buried a husband, lost a career, watched her one skill get shipped to another hemisphere, and she'd gotten up every single morning and done the next thing, and she had never once asked anybody to be impressed by it. And a man she'd never met took one look and said, "Whatever this is, it isn't real, because look at you." That's the cruelty, not the laugh. Ruth Ann drove home from the fairgrounds with the sample panel on the passenger seat. She did not cry. She wants that in the record too. People assume she cried, and she found that irritating for the rest of her life. What she did was get about 4 miles down the road and pull over onto the gravel shoulder by the Baptist cemetery and sit there with the engine running. And she said, out loud to the windshield, "A hobby." Pause. "A hobby." She put both hands on the wheel. 64. He's not wrong about 64. 64 is a fact. You are 64 and your knee's bad and you can't lift a full sheet of anything by yourself, and last Thursday you had to sit down on a customer's stairs for 10 minutes because you got dizzy and you didn't tell anyone. That's true. All of that is true. And you did 9 closets. And Wilma Sharpe cried in her own hallway. And there is a company 9 miles from your house paying $8,000 a year to bury the answer in the ground. And that man in there with the sign that says expert has been selling particle board for 19 years and has never once in his life stood under a lamp and looked at what a moth does to cashmere. And he picked up that panel and turned it over. He turned it over. She sat up, because she'd just heard herself. He turned it over. Nobody turns over a thing they think is a hobby. You look at the front of it and you set it down. Turning it over is what you do when you're checking the joinery. Ruth Ann Beckert sat in her truck on the shoulder of a county road outside a Baptist cemetery in April of 2010 and started, slowly, to smile. Then she pulled back, onto the road, and drove home. That night she opened the notebook to the page she'd written on at the show. For words, in front of him, in her small square hand, they said, he checked the joint. She flipped to a clean page, and she started a list because that is what Ruth Ann Beckert did with a feeling. She turned it into a list, and the list turned into a plan, and the plan turned into work, and the work got done. That was the whole engine of the woman. The list said, 1. 9 days is too long. Build panels in the shop. 2. Need help. 1 person. Somebody good with a router. 3. Talk to Cavanaugh. Regular delivery. Offer to pay. 4. Call Corinne. She looked at number 4 for a while. Then she got up and turned off the light over the stove and went to bed and did not call Corinne. That took her another 3 years, and it did not go the way she'd hoped. But number 3 she did on Monday. She drove out to Cavanaugh Pencil, and she asked for Emmett Pryor, and when he came out to the front office and saw who it was he said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, I thought we got that hauled off." And Ruth Ann said, "Don't haul it off." Emmett Pryor stopped. "Ma'am? Don't haul it off. Bring me more." And then she put a single sheet of paper on the counter, typed at the library, because she didn't own a computer, and she said, "I'll pay you $100 a delivery, twice a month. You save $6,000 a year and I get the scrap." Emmett Pryor picked up the sheet of paper. He read it. He read it a second time. And then Emmett Pryor, 60 years old, 22 years at Cavanaugh, looked at a woman in a flannel shirt standing on the other side of his counter, and said the most honest thing anybody said to Ruth Ann Beckert in the entire year of 2010. He said, "Why has nobody ever asked me this before?" He took it to corporate on a Wednesday. Corporate approved it in 9 days. The first scheduled delivery came on the second Tuesday in May of 2010, and this time the driver got out of the cab, and he walked over, and he handed Ruth Ann a clipboard and said, "Ma'am, where do you want it?" And Ruth Ann Beckert pointed at a spot beside the shed, and signed her name. Tessa Yarbrough knocked on the shed door on a Tuesday in September of 2010. She was 31. She had a tape measure clipped to her belt and a truck outside with a ladder rack and 11 years of finished carpentry behind her, most of it for a contractor who had just laid off 4 people and kept his nephew. She said, "Are you the Cedar lady?" Ruth Ann said, "I don't know what I am." Tessa said, "Somebody in town said you were the Cedar lady." Ruth Ann wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at her, then past her at the truck, at the ladder rack and the way the extension ladder was strapped down. 2 straps, crossed. Most people use one. Ruth Ann said, "Can you run a router?" Tessa said, "Can you afford me?" "No." "Figured. Beat." Tessa said, "Show me the joint anyway." Ruth Ann took her over to the bench and put a piece in her hand. Tongue and groove, cedar, narrow, wide, narrow, sanded to 220. Tessa turned it over, and Ruth Ann felt something go tight and warm in her chest because that was the second time in 5 months that somebody had turned it over, and she was starting to understand that the whole world sorted into 2 kinds of people, and that was the sorting. Tessa held it up to the light, ran a thumb down the groove. She said, "Your groove's a hair deep on the back half. You're pushing at the end of the pass." Ruth Ann said, "I know, so fix it. My arm gets tired." And Tessa Yarbrough, 31 years old, unemployed since the 9th of August, said, "Then hire an arm." She started the next morning at $14 an hour, which Ruth Ann could not pay, and paid anyway. Here's what that did. Because Ruth Ann had been doing a closet in 9 days, then 7, then 6 alone on her knees on a drop cloth in a stranger's hallway, fitting irregular scrap 1 piece at a time, and sanding it in place with the homeowner's furniture pushed into the middle of the bedroom. Now there were 2 of them, and on the 4th day, standing in a hallway with sawdust in her hair, Tessa said the sentence that changed the shape of the entire business. She said, "Why are we doing this here?" Ruth Ann said, "Because that's where the closet is." Tessa said, "The closet's not going anywhere. Build it at the shop." Panels. That's the whole idea. Instead of fitting 300 loose pieces on site, you build the wall in the shed, flat, on a bench, at a comfortable height with good light, and you carry it in as a unit. Ruth Ann stood in that hallway for about 8 seconds. Then she said, "We'd have to standardize the depth." "So standardize it." "Closets aren't standard. They're close enough. You scribe the last 6 inches. Scribe the last 6 inches. Ruth Ann had spent 27 years finding the flaw in the fabric. She had never once had somebody standing next to her who found the flaw in her. She said, "How long have you been thinking that?" Tessa said, "Since Tuesday." "You started Tuesday?" "Yes, ma'am." Installation time dropped from 6 days to 2, then to 1.5. By spring of 2011, they could do a standard reach-in in a single day, walls, ceiling, shelving, trim, and be out, before the homeowner got back from work. Which meant the number of closets went up. Which meant the revenue went up. Which meant, and this is the part nobody warns you about, the problems went up. Different problems. Better problems. But problems. Revenue, 2011. $86,950. Ruth Ann was 65 years old. She had a second employee by August, a kid named DeWitt Marsh, who was 19 and slow and careful, and had exactly the temperament for sanding. She bought a used enclosed trailer for $800. She got a business license and a checking account with the words Beckert Cedar on the top of the checks, and the first time she wrote one she had to stop and look at it. And in October of 2011, for the first time since May of 2007, Ruth Ann Beckert had a full night's sleep, which she noticed and felt guilty about, which is a thing widows do that nobody talks about. Now, the card on the wall above the sander. Index card. Ruth Ann's handwriting. No finish. The smell is the product. That card had been up there since June of 2009. Everybody who worked in that shed read it on their first day and never thought about it again, including Ruth Ann. Because in the spring of 2012, something started happening that she had not planned for. The customers changed. For the first 3 years, it had been women like Wilma Sharpe, 70-something, Depot Street, a mother's chest, a grandmother's stole, a specific piece of ruined wool, with a name attached to it. Then a realtor named Bonnie Halvorson put a Beckert closet in a listing photo, and the listing sold in 9 days. And Bonnie Halvorson told 4 other realtors. And suddenly Ruth Ann Beckert was getting calls from new construction outside Nashville. 4,000 square foot houses. Master closets the size of her first apartment. Women in their 40s with granite in the kitchen and a walk-in with an island in the middle of it. And those women asked a different question. Wilma Sharpe had asked, "Can you do anything with it?" These women asked, "Is that the finish?" The first time Ruth Ann explained it, politely, thoroughly, standing in a half-built closet with a woman named Paige who had a folder of magazine tear-outs. Cedral. Vapor. Enclosed space. The oils have to breathe. Paige listened to all of it. Then Paige said, "But it looks unfinished." Ruth Ann said, "It is unfinished." Paige said, "Right, that's what I'm saying." It happened again in May. Again in June. In July, a woman put her hand flat on a cedar wall Ruth Ann had spent 2 days on, and said, "It feels like a sauna." And it was not said cruelly. That's the thing. Nobody in this part of the story is a villain. She said it the way you'd say a couch was beige. But Ruth Ann drove home, that evening on the interstate, with her jaw set, and her brain would not be quiet. Feels like a sauna. $1,200. $2,400. For that one. $2,400, and she put her hand on it like it was a locker room. You know what the problem is. You know exactly what the problem is. It doesn't look like it cost anything. Because it didn't. Because it's garbage. It is literally garbage, Ruth, and it came out of a dumpster, and every single one of those women can tell, they can all tell, stop. They can't tell. They can tell. She gripped the wheel. And underneath all of it, way underneath, in a place she would not have admitted was there, a hobby. She started testing finishes in August. Just testing. That's what she told herself. Just to see. Scrap pieces on the bench. A wiping poly. A satin lacquer. A hard wax oil that cost $31 a quart, and that she had to order. And here is the thing that makes this so cruel. They looked magnificent. The cedar under a finish is not the same wood. The grain comes up out of nowhere. The reds go deep, and the pale gold goes to honey, and the whole thing stops looking like a shed wall, and starts looking like a piece of furniture. Catches light. It looks like money. Ruth Ann stood at that bench on a Thursday night in August of 2012, with the shop light on, and turned a finished sample over in her hands, and she thought, oh, that's it. That's what they want. And then, because she was not a stupid woman, because she was in fact the least stupid woman in Caldwell County, she looked up at the card. And she did the thing. She lifted the finished sample to her face, and she smelled it. And it smelled like cedar. It smelled like cedar. That's the trap. That's the whole trap, right there. Because the finish doesn't kill the smell on day one. The wood is saturated. There's residual oil on the surface in the sawdust in the shop air. You put a coat of poly on a piece of red cedar, and hold it to your face, that same evening, and you will smell cedar, and you will think, see? It's fine. It's fine. The old-timers were being dramatic. Give it 4 months. The surface oils flash off. And underneath, the film has sealed every pore in the wood, and the cedral that was supposed to move out of the timber and into the air for the next 40 years is now sitting in there behind a plastic wall, doing absolutely nothing for anybody. The closet still smells faintly of cedar, and it protects nothing at all. Ruth Ann Beckert put a satin finish on 22 closets between September of 2012 and January of 2013. She did not tell Tessa she was thinking about it. She just came in one morning and said, "We're going to try a finish on the Ridgemont job." And Tessa looked up from the bench. And Tessa looked at the card on the wall. And then Tessa looked at Ruth Ann said, "It's one job." Tessa said, "Okay." That's all she said. Okay. She was 33 years old, and she'd been there 2 years, and Ruth Ann Beckert signed her paycheck, and she said okay and went back to work. Ruth Ann would think about that okay for the rest of her life. They sold better. Of course they sold better. The photos were better. Bonnie Halvorson loved them. Average job value went from $1,850 to $2,400 because Ruth Ann added a finish-up charge. And in the fourth quarter of 2012, Beckert Cedar did more revenue than the first 2 years combined. Ruth Ann bought a used van. She gave Tessa a raise to 19. She sat at her kitchen table in December of 2012 with the numbers in front of her and allowed herself for about 10 minutes to feel like she knew what she was doing, which is generally when it happens. The first call came on the 12th of June, 2013. A woman, politely, almost apologetically, she said she'd found some damage on a cashmere wrap, and she was sure it was her own fault. She'd probably brought it in from storage, but she just wanted to ask. Ruth Ann said she'd come look. She drove up on a Thursday, and she stood in that closet, her walls, her joinery, honey-colored and beautiful under the light fixture, and she took the wrap over to the window and turned it in the light. Fuzzy edges. Not clean. Larvae. Ruth Ann Beckert stood in a stranger's walk-in closet, with a $900 cashmere wrap in her hands, and she felt the floor go out from under her in a way she had not felt since a hallway in Nashville in 2007. She said, "Ma'am, do you have anything else in here made of wool?" The woman said, "A few things." Ruth Ann said, "Would you get them for me, please?" There were 3 more. She drove home and did not remember the drive. She went into the shed. It was almost 9 at night. She turned on the light and went to the offcut bin and found a piece from the Ridgemont job, 9 months old, finished satin, and a raw piece from a delivery that morning. She held one to her face, then the other, then the first again. And in the raw one there was that punch, that clean sharp thing that goes past your nose and into 1958. And in the finished one there was nothing. A ghost. A memory of a smell. Wood and a faint sweetness. and underneath it very slightly plastic. Ruth Ann sat down on the floor of that shed. 67 years old, on a concrete floor, with a piece of cedar in each hand. And she said, out loud, you knew. It was on the wall. You wrote it. You wrote it yourself in your own hand and taped it up there, and you looked at it every single day for 4 years, and you wanted it to look expensive. You wanted it to not look like garbage. Because a man at a fairgrounds in 2010 called it a hobby, and you have been trying to prove him wrong for 3 years, and she put her hand over her mouth, because she'd just gotten to the bottom of it, and the bottom was worse than she thought. You didn't ruin it for the customers. You ruined it for him. 22 closets between September 2012 and January 2013, and she pulled the invoices and made a list at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning, and the list had 22 names on it, and the first name on it was a woman whose grandmother's wrap was in a bag in Ruth Ann's truck. She sat with that list until it got light. Tessa came in at 7. Ruth Ann was sitting on the shop bench, with the list in her hand, and Tessa took one look at her and said, "What?" Ruth Ann said, "The finish," and Tessa Yarbrough closed her eyes, because she'd known. On some level, since the morning she said okay, she had known, and she had not pushed because Ruth Ann signed her checks, and that is a thing Tessa would carry too. Tessa said, "How bad?" Ruth Ann said, 22. Tessa said, "Jesus." Ruth Ann said, "Yeah." Then Ruth Ann stood up, and Tessa said, "What do you want to do?" And Ruth Ann Beckert said, "All of them." Here's what all of them meant. Drive to 22 houses, some of them 90 minutes away. Stand in 22 doorways and tell 22 people that the thing you sold them does not work, and that it does not work because of a decision you made personally against your own written instructions. Then tear it out, then rebuild it, then charge nothing. The accountant she'd hired, that spring, a man named Roland Jest, honest and not expensive, whose name Wilma Sharpe had given her in 2011, ran the numbers on a legal pad, while Ruth Ann sat across the desk. Labor, materials, freight, lost billable days. 2 of the jobs had built-in drawers. He circled a figure and turned the pad around. $31,400. He said, "Ruth Ann, you cleared 38 last year." She said, "I know." He said, "There's another way to handle this." She looked at him. He said, "You disclose it going forward. You stop finishing. Anybody calls, you make it right, one at a time, as they come." Silence. He said, "Most of them will never call." He wasn't being crooked. He was being practical. 19 out of 22 people would have opened that closet in 5 years, found a hole in a sweater and blamed the sweater. Ruth Ann looked at the number for a long moment. Then she said, "They wouldn't call, because they'd think it was their fault." Roland Jess said, "Well, yes." And Ruth Ann said, "That's why I'm going." She started on a Monday. She did it herself. Every single one. Tessa offered and Ruth Ann said no, and it was the only time in 6 years the 2 of them came close to an argument. Ruth Ann said, "You didn't do it." Tessa said, "I didn't stop you." Ruth Ann said, "That's not the same thing and you know it." And Tessa said, "I said okay." And Ruth Ann said, "Quiet. So did I." The script never got easier. She'd stand on the porch. They'd open the door and be glad to see her, because everybody was always glad to see her, because she was a 67-year-old woman with white hair and a tape measure and everybody's grandmother. And she'd say, "Ma'am, I made a mistake in your house, and I've come to fix it," 22 times. Some of them were fine about it. Some of them were not. One man, one of only 3 husbands in the whole group, did not believe her. He thought it was a scam. He thought she was working an angle where she tore out a good closet and billed him for a new one, and he stood in his own foyer and said, "So what's this actually going to cost me?" In a tone, and Ruth Ann said, "Nothing, sir." And he said nothing, and she said nothing, and he looked at her for about 4 seconds, and then he said, "Huh." A woman cried, not about the closet, about a coat. It came out sideways, the way these things do. A coat that had been her mother's, and it was ruined. and she'd thought it was her own carelessness, and she'd been carrying that for 8 months. Ruth Ann stood in that kitchen and let her cry, and did not say anything, because there wasn't anything. And one woman, a woman named Delphina, 71, in a farmhouse out past the county line, listened to the whole thing on her front porch and then said, "Why are you telling me?" Ruth Ann said, "Because it's true." And Delphina said, "Honey, that's not an answer people give." Took her from June until the second week of October. For months, 22 closets torn out and rebuilt, raw, unfinished, exactly the way the card on the wall had said since 2009. The last one was the first call. Ruth Ann saved her for the end on purpose, and never told anybody why. When it was done, she stood in the doorway, and the woman opened it, and the smell came out and hit them both. And the woman said, "Oh, that's different." Ruth Ann said, "Yes, ma'am." And then Ruth Ann went out to the van and sat in the driver's seat and put both hands on the wheel and did not start it for a while. The books for 2013 were a bloodbath. Revenue was up. Revenue was actually up. $94,000. Net was $1,900. For a full year of work at 67 years old with a bad knee 6 and 7 days a week. She almost lost the shed. She missed a payment on the van. She sold Carl's boat, which she had not used one single time since 2007 and which she cried about in a way she had not cried about the china. And in November of 2013, Ruth Ann Beckert sat at her kitchen table under the light, over the stove with a bank statement in front of her. And she said out loud to nobody, "He was right. A hobby. A hobby that costs you $31,000 is a hobby, Ruth, and that is the definition of a hobby." That's when the phone rang. It was a Sunday. 11 minutes, more or less. Weather, work, the neighbor's dog. Corinne. Except this time Corinne said, "Bonnie Halvorson's sister works with me." Silence. Corinne said, "Mom, she sent me a listing photo. With your closet in it." Ruth Ann said, "Oh." Corinne said, "Oh." Ruth Ann said, "It's not. It's a small thing, honey." And Corinne said, "You have a van." She drove up the following Saturday. And it went badly, and it went badly in about 11 minutes. Corinne came in, looked around, registered instantly the way daughters do that the china cabinet was empty. She said, "Where's the china?" Ruth Ann said, "I've got coffee." "Mom, where's the china?" "Sit down." "Where is the china?" "Beat." Ruth Ann said, "I sold it in 2009. Corinne sat down, hard. She said, "For what?" Ruth Ann said, "A table saw." And Corinne laughed. "One note, not a nice one." She said, "You sold Grandma's china for a table saw. It was your father's aunt's." "That's not the point, Mom." "Then what is the point, Corinne?" And then it came out. All of it. For years of it, in a rush, the way it does when somebody's been holding it, that she'd driven down, and the house looked the same, but the shed had a sign on it. That there were bank statements on the table with numbers on them that made no sense. That her mother was 67 years old, and on her knees in strangers' houses an hour and a half away. That the knee was bad. That Ruth Ann had been dizzy on a job in April, and told Tessa not to mention it, and Tessa had mentioned it to Bonnie, who mentioned it to her sister. And then Corinne said the thing. She said, "Mom, you're not building anything. You're just hiding." Silence in that kitchen. The light over the stove buzzing. And Ruth Ann Beckert did not raise her voice. She did not throw anything. She did not defend herself, which is the same thing she had done at a fairgrounds in 2010, and it was for the same reason, and the reason was that both times some part of her was afraid it might be true. She said, "All right." Corinne said, "Don't do that." "Do what?" That all right. Dad used to do that." And Ruth Ann said, "No. Your father used to say, 'Let me think on it.'" Beat. "That's different. And you never once knew the difference." Corinne left the next morning at 6. Ruth Ann heard the car and did not get up. She went out to the shed at 7:30. Turned on the light. Stood there. And what she did next was not brave. There's a version of the story where a woman gets knocked down and gets up swinging, and that is not what happened. What happened is that Ruth Ann Beckert, 67 years old, broke with a daughter who'd just driven off, walked over to the wall above the sander, and looked at that index card. For years it had been up there. Everybody had read it. Nobody had understood it, including her, so she took it down. And she got a new card and a marker and she wrote something longer. Took her 4 tries. And when she was done it said, "No finish, ever. The oil in the wood has to reach the air. Seal the surface and you kill it. It will still smell like cedar for 4 months. Then it is just wood. If you don't understand this, ask me." Every time, she taped it up, and underneath it on a second card, she wrote 2 words, "Smell both," and she put a raw offcut and a finished offcut in a coffee can on the shelf beneath it, and from that day forward every single person who ever worked in that building, and eventually there were 41 of them, picked up 2 pieces of wood on their first morning and put them to their face. Nobody was ever confused again. The 2014 winter was warm. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's the mechanism that turned this entire story around, and it was not brilliance and it was not grit. It was weather. A mild winter across Middle Tennessee, which meant the overwintering larvae did not get killed off. Then a wet, warm spring humid through April and May. And in a species like Tiniola basileella, which lives in the dark, which does not fly toward light, which most people have never actually seen because the adults are the size of a grain of rice and hide in the folds of things, that combination is a population explosion. The State Extension Office put out an advisory in June. Nobody read it. People started reading it in July. Because in July, people started opening the boxes. That's the timing of it. You store your winter things in April. You don't look at them again until you pull the sweaters down in September, and by then it's over, but a certain kind of person goes into the closet in July for something else entirely. A funeral, a wedding, a cold snap, and they find it. And the thing about moth damage that nobody understands until it happens to them is that it is never one whole. It's a coat and a scarf and the good blanket and the christening gown in the box, and your mother stole all at once, all in the same season, because the larvae have been in there since March eating in the dark. The County Weekly ran a piece in the 3rd week of July, and on the front page, above the fold, there was a photograph of Wilma Sharpe. She was 79 by then. She was standing in her upstairs hallway on Depot Street, with the closet door open behind her. And the reporter, a kid, 24, first real job, had asked her a simple question, and Wilma Sharpe had given him the single most valuable 4 sentences anybody ever said about Beckert Cedar, and it did not cost Ruth Ann $1 because Ruth Ann did not know it was happening. Wilma said, "I've had this closet since 2009. I have not lost one thing. Mildred next door has the wire shelves. She lost 4 sweaters and my brother's overcoat this summer. It's not a fancy closet. It just works." The paper came out on a Wednesday. The phone started at 8:40 that morning. By Friday, Ruth Ann Beckert had 63 inquiries. But that's not the part. Because 63 inquiries is a good week, and a good week is not a business. What turned that summer into something permanent was a thing Ruth Ann had spent $31,000 on in 2013, and had considered at the time the stupidest financial decision of her entire life. 22 women. 22 women scattered across 4 counties, who had opened their front doors in the summer of 2013, and found a white-haired woman on the porch saying, "I made a mistake in your house, and I've come to fix it." And in July of 2014, when everybody in Middle Tennessee was suddenly, urgently, furiously talking about moths in church parking lots, at the co-op, on the phone, with their sisters, every single one of those 22 women told that story. Every one. Because it's a good story. Because nothing like that had ever happened to them before. Because in a lifetime of contractors and warranties and fine print, and well ma'am that's not covered, one woman had shown up unasked, and torn out her own work and rebuilt it for free and told them the truth about why. Delphine Ott told it at a funeral. The man who'd thought it was a scam told it at his golf club, and told it badly, and it still worked. The woman who'd cried about her mother's coat told it to 9 people in 3 days. You cannot buy that. There is no amount of money in the world that buys that. Beckert Cedar closed 2014 at $312,000. Ruth Ann was 68 years old. And on a Tuesday in November of 2014, driving back from a job, she came up Madison Street and slowed down without meaning to, because there was a man on a ladder in front of a showroom, taking down a sign, Caldwell County's closet expert since 1991. Ruth Ann did not stop. She'd like it known that she did not stop and that she did not slow down to look, and that she had honestly not thought about Dale Renfrow in over 2 years. But she saw it, and she got to the light at the end of the block, and it was red, and she sat there. And she waited to feel it. Whatever it was supposed to be. The thing you're supposed to feel. It didn't come. What came instead was a picture, unbidden, sharp as a photograph. A man in a metal building at the fairgrounds in April of 2010, picking up a sample panel off a folding table, from a church basement, and turning it over. The light went green, and Ruth Ann Beckert said, out loud, in an empty van, in a voice she did not entirely recognize, "Why did you check the joint?" He came in March of 2015, almost a year to the week after the sign came down. Thursday morning, cold. Ruth Ann was at the table, saw breaking down a panel, and Tessa came back, through the shop and said, "There's a man out front." Ruth Ann said, "Which man?" Tessa said, "You'll want to see." The truck in the lot had 190,000 miles on it, and a cracked tail light held together with red tape. Dale Renfrow was standing beside it, with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at the building. He was 63 now. He had lost weight in the way men lose weight when they have not planned to. Ruth Ann shut off the saw, took her glasses off, walked out. He said, "Mrs. Beckert." She said, "Mr. Renfrow." He said, "I heard you might be taking on installers." She said, "I might be." He said, "I've got 24 years in this county. I know every house in it. I know which ones have plaster and which ones have that 1978 paneling, and I know which ones have a floor joist running the wrong way in the master." "Beat," he said. "That last one's worth something." And it was. That last one was worth quite a lot, actually. Ruth Ann said, "Come inside." She poured him coffee in the little office off the shop floor. 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, a calendar from the feed store. He held the cup and didn't drink it, and Ruth Ann sat down across from him and said, "Do you remember the fairgrounds?" He said, "Yes. April 2010. "Yes. You said." He said, "I know what I said." Silence. And then Dale Renfrow set the coffee down and reached inside his jacket and took out a folded stack of paper and put it on the desk between them. He said, "Before you decide anything, read that." It was a distributor agreement, dated January 9th, 1991. Renfrow Home Solutions and a laminate systems distributor out of Nashville. 22 pages. The kind of document a 39-year-old man signs in a strip mall office, because it is the only way anybody will extend him inventory credit, and he has a wife and 2 kids and a lease. Ruth Ann put her glasses back on. Renfrow reached across and turned it to page 14. Section 8. 3. Exclusivity. And she read it. She read it twice. For the duration of the agreement, and for a period of 24 months following termination, the dealer would not manufacture, market, distribute, or install any closet or storage system incorporating solid dimensional lumber of any species. Any species. 24 months after termination. And termination, per Section 12, required a written notice period of 180 days and forfeiture of all outstanding inventory credit, which for Dale Renfrow in any given year of his life was somewhere between $40,000 and $90,000 he did not have. Ruth Ann took her glasses off. She said, "Why are you showing me this?" And Dale Renfrow said, "Because I proposed Cedar in 1994. He told it flat. No performance in it. A man reading his own file out loud. That in the spring of 1994 he had done a job in a farmhouse out past the county line, and the woman had an old cedar-lined closet from the 30s, and she'd wanted it torn out for a laminate system, and he had torn it out. And on the way to the dump he'd pulled over, and sat with a truck bed full of 80-year-old red cedar, and thought, why would anybody rip this out? that he'd gone home and read about it. Not much, there wasn't much in 1994, not without a library card and a Saturday, but enough. Cedral. The vapor. The chest. That he'd written a 2-page letter to the distributor in Nashville proposing a cedar lining product line. He'd typed it on a borrowed typewriter, because he thought handwritten looked unserious. That the rep had called him 11 days later, and been perfectly friendly about it. The rep said, "Dale, we move volume. Nobody's buying a smell." And then the rep said, in the same friendly voice, "And you want to look at 8.3 there before you get any further along with it." Ruth Ann sat very still. Dale Renfrow said, "I hauled cedar out of 40, 50 houses over the years. 50 at least. 20s, 30s construction, all of it. Tore it out and put laminate in and got paid for it." He said, "And every single time I put it in the truck I knew." And then he looked up at her across a desk in a converted body shop, 63 years old, out of business on his second mortgage, and he said, "I didn't laugh at you because I thought you were wrong. Beat. I laughed at you because you were doing the one thing I signed a paper saying I wouldn't." Ruth Ann Beckert sat there, and her brain did that thing. He knew. He knew the whole time. He knew before you did. He knew in 1994. You were still at the mill in 1994. You were standing under a lamp looking at broken picks, and this man was pulling cedar out of houses, and you hated him for 5 years. 5 years. You hated a man for 5 years, and he was, no, wait, don't do that. He still said it. He still stood there in front of 2 contractors and said, "Sweetheart, at your age," and let them laugh and did not correct them and drove home and slept fine. Both things. Both things are true, and you have to hold both of them, and that is, God, that's exhausting. She said, out loud, "That must have been a very long 19 years. And Dale Renfrow, who had not cried in front of another human being since his father's funeral in 1988, put his hand over his eyes, just for a second. Then he took it away and picked up the coffee and drank some. She hired him, not out of pity. She wants that clear, and so do I. She hired him because he knew where the floor joist ran wrong in every 1970s master bedroom in Caldwell County, and because a man who has been forbidden to do a thing for 2 decades does that thing carefully. He worked as an installation subcontractor for Beckert Cedar from April of 2015 until he retired in 2019. He was, by every account, meticulous. He trained 6 installers, and the first thing he made every one of them do on their first morning was walk over to a shelf and pick up 2 pieces of wood out of a coffee can and put them to their face. The company grew. Here's the shape of it quickly, because this part is numbers and you didn't come for numbers. 2015. They moved into an old body shop on Elm Street. 3,200 square feet. 2016. They added a wholesale panel line, prefabricated cedar panels sold direct to builders, who installed them themselves in houses Ruth Ann never saw, in counties she'd never driven through. That was the thing that broke the ceiling. Because installation is limited by how many hours are in a day and how many knees you've got. Wholesale isn't limited by anything. 2017. 7 full-time employees. DeWitt Marsh, who had been 19 and slow and careful in 2011, was 25 and running the sanding line and had a daughter. 2018. Emmett Pryor expanded the Cavanaugh supply agreement for the 3rd time. For deliveries a month. The mill assigned a specific person to manage the account. He retired that October. At the party, somebody asked him what he was proudest of, and Emmett Pryor, 69, 31 years at that plant, said, "We used to pay $8,000 a year to bury that stuff." He said, "Now it's a line item that makes money." He said, "And I didn't think of it." A lady in a flannel shirt walked in and asked me one question. 2019 closed at $436,000. Ruth Ann Beckert was 73 years old. Then 2020. You remember 2020. Installation stopped in March. All of it at once, because you cannot send 4 people into a stranger's bedroom in April of 2020. Ruth Ann sat at her kitchen table and did the math on how long she could make payroll, and the answer was 11 weeks. Except the wholesale line didn't stop. Because new construction was essential in Tennessee, and the builders kept building, and the builders kept ordering panels, and the panels shipped on a truck, and nobody had to go inside anybody's house. And then something happened that Ruth Ann did not predict and could not have. Everybody was home. Everybody was home all day, for months, staring at the inside of their own house. And a great many people in this country opened a closet in April of 2020 for the first time in years, and actually looked at it, at the wire shelf, the sagging rod, the peeling laminate, the sweaters they hadn't thought about since 2014, and thought, what is this? Website traffic tripled between March and June. The inquiries came in faster than she could answer them. She hired a part-time office girl just to answer email. She was 74 years old, and she had never spent $1 on advertising in her life. 2020 closed at $312,000. Exactly 2014. To the thousand. She noticed that. She sat with the spreadsheet and noticed it, and something about it made the hair stand up on her arms. She mentioned it to Corinne on the phone in December. Which, yes, we need to talk about Corinne. They had not fixed it. I want to be honest with you because there is a version of this where the daughter comes back in Act 2 with a speech and everybody hugs, and it is not true, and you would know it wasn't true. After that Saturday in November of 2013, they went back to Sundays. 11 minutes. Weather, work, the neighbor's dog. For 7 years. 7 years of two women who loved each other enormously, getting on the phone every 7 days and successfully avoiding every single thing that mattered. But something did change, and it changed so slowly neither of them could have told you when. Because Corinne started asking about the business. Little things. Sideways. How's Tessa? Did the van get fixed? Bonnie's sister said y'all did a house out in Belgrove. And Ruth Ann would answer. And then one Sunday in 2017, Corinne asked what the wholesale margin was. And Ruth Ann told her. And Corinne said, that's better than the installs. And Ruth Ann said, I know it. And Corinne said, so push it. And that was the whole thing. That was as close as they got for 4 years, and it was, in the language of that family, a full embrace. Now, February of 2021. The letter came on a Thursday. Cavanaugh Pencil Company was consolidating operations. The Marlow Bend processing facility would close in September. Certain production functions would relocate. 2 paragraphs. Ruth Ann read it standing at the mailbox at the end of her drive. Then she read it again in the truck. Then she drove to the shop and did not tell anybody for 4 hours. Because here's what that letter meant. 12 years. 12 years, almost to the month, since a dump truck backed across a fence line that wasn't there anymore. 12 years of cedar arriving on a schedule at 4 cents a board foot, when the retail price of Eastern red cedar was running $3 and change. That was not a discount. That was the entire business. Strip it out and Beckert Cedar's material cost goes from 6% of revenue to something north of 40%, overnight in September, with a wholesale contract book already priced for the year. Ruth Ann sat in the office with the calendar from the feed store on the wall and did the arithmetic on a legal pad. The company had 7 months to live. She called Emmett Pryor. Retired. Living out toward the lake with a baseboat. He picked up and said, Ruth Ann. She said, you heard. He said, I heard Tuesday. I've been trying to figure out how to call you. Then he said, I'm sorry. I'm real sorry. And Ruth Ann Beckert said the sentence that people in Caldwell County still repeat. Don't be sorry, Emmett. Tell me where the cedar goes. Long pause on that line. Emmett Pryor said, say again? She said, the billets, the raw stock, the inventory in that yard. When they close it in September, where does it go? And Emmett Pryor, who had spent 31 years at that plant and had known this woman for 12, started laughing. Not at her. He said, Lord, 12 years and I still didn't see it coming. He said, it gets liquidated. Sealed bid. Probably August. He said, Ruth, and that's a lot of wood. And she said, how much? It was 410,000 board feet of kiln-dried Eastern red cedar. Enough to run Beckert Cedar for somewhere between 6 and 9 years. The bid would come in somewhere around $140,000, Emmett figured, because who else wants it? Pencil billets are the wrong dimension for furniture, and the wrong species for flooring, and there is not a lumber broker in the Southeast who wants 400,000 board feet of anything that specific. $140,000. Ruth Ann Beckert, at 75 years old, had liquid assets of about 61. She went to the bank on a Monday. A 75-year-old woman in a good blouse with a manila folder sitting across a desk from a loan officer who was 34. 12 years of returns in that folder. Growth every single year but one. A wholesale contract book. A signed letter from Emmett Pryor. Photographs. And the loan officer looked at all of it. And he was polite. He was extremely polite. And he said, "Mrs. Beckert, this is a very strong file." And then he said, "Can I ask about succession?" She said, "Pardon." He said, "The note would be 7 years. Beat." He said, "I just want to understand the continuity plan." And Ruth Ann Beckert sat in a chair in a bank, 75 years old, with 12 years of profit in a folder in front of her. And heard it again, 11 years later, in a bank, out of a boy who was born the year she started at the mill, and it was not even unkind, it was actuarial, it was responsible. Say something. Say something, Ruth, and say I'll outlive the note. Say I've got a bad knee and a good heart and my mother made it to 94. Say, she said, I'll get you a plan. And she stood up and shook his hand and drove home. And here's the thing. She didn't have one. That's the truth of it. 75 years old, 7 employees, 4 counties, a wholesale book, and Ruth Ann Beckert had never once written down what happened to any of it, if she died. Because she'd never expected any of it to exist. Because it started as a thing to do on Tuesday evenings, so she wouldn't be alone in a kitchen. She sat at that kitchen table under the light, over the stove for 4 nights. And on the 4th night she picked up the phone. It was a Wednesday, not a Sunday. Corinne answered on the 2nd ring, and said, immediately, in a completely different voice, "What's wrong?" Ruth Ann said, "Nothing's wrong. Mom, it's Wednesday. I know what day it is. You don't call on Wednesday." Beat. Ruth Ann said, "The mill's closing." And then she talked for 19 minutes, which she had not done in 14 years. All of it. The letter, the 410,000 board feet, the sealed bid in August, the $140,000 she did not have, the bank, the boy at the bank, the word succession. And when she was done there was silence on that line. And Corinne Beckert, 49 years old, medical billing, Nashville, who had spent 7 years reading her mother's business the way other people read a novel they were not allowed to admit they loved, said, "How long do I have?" Ruth Ann said, "What?" Corinne said, "The bid, August. How long do I have to put a file together?" Ruth Ann Beckert stood in her kitchen, with the phone against her ear. And she said, "Honey, you don't have to." And Corinne said, "Mom, Beat, let me think on it." That's what she said. Her father's words, in her father's cadence. From a woman who had spent a decade insisting she did not understand her father at all. And Ruth Ann had to put her hand flat on the counter. Because let me think on it never once meant no. It had never meant no in 41 years, and it did not mean no now. Corinne drove down that weekend. She did not apologize. Neither of them did, not that day, not ever, and if you come from a family like that one you know exactly why and you don't need it explained. What she did was come in the kitchen door at 9 in the morning with a laptop bag and a box of file folders and say, "Where's your depreciation schedule?" And Ruth Ann said, "My what?" And Corinne said, "Oh, Mother." They worked for 6 weeks. At that kitchen table. Under that light over the stove. 2 women who could not say one true thing to each other. Building a 70-page continuity plan for a company that lined closets with pencil scrap. Corinne wrote the operations transfer. Tessa Yarbrough as operations manager, with a defined path to a minority stake. Ruth Ann wrote the section on the material. She wrote it by hand for pages and Corinne typed it in and did not change a word of it, and it is still in that document today, and it starts, "The product is not the wood. The product is the oil in the wood reaching the air." The bank approved the note on the 9th of June, 2021. The sealed bid opened in August. Beckert Cedar was one of two bidders. The other was a mulch operation. Two states over that bid $41,000 because to them it was fuel. Ruth Ann's bid was $138,000. They took delivery over 5 weeks in September and October. 22 truckloads. She had to lease a yard on the edge of town and build a cover for it, and it was financially the most exposed she had been since 2013. And then in October the last thing happened. Because Cavanaugh laid off 91 people in Marlow Bend, Tennessee, in a county with about 49,000 in it. Ruth Ann hired 9 of them. She did not do it as a gesture. She needed people. She had a yard full of billets that had to be broken down into stock, and she had exactly 7 employees and a 75-year-old back. But she hired mill hands, on purpose, over people with more finish experience. Because a man who has spent 20 years around a resaw does not need to be taught what wood does. One of them was a man named Ferris Whitlock, 58, 26 years at Cavanaugh. Drove a truck for them the first 9 years, and ran the sorting line the last 17. He came in for the interview in a clean shirt, with his cap in his hands. And Ruth Ann Beckert looked at him across the desk and knew. She knew instantly, the way you know a face you saw once, from 60 feet away, through a kitchen window on a cold morning in March. It's him. That's the truck. That's the man in the truck. He backed across my fence line and dumped 4 tons on my ground and drove off without getting out of the cab and say something. Say, do you remember? Say March of 2009. Say you, and then what? And then what? Ruth Ann. He's 58. He's got a cap in his hands. He was doing what they told him with a truck they gave him at a place that just threw him away after 26 years. And if he hadn't done it, she sat with that. If he hadn't done it, you'd have sat in that kitchen for another 10 years. She said, "Can you start Monday?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." He said, "Ma'am, can I ask, how'd you get into Cedar?" And Ruth Ann Beckert said, "Somebody left some in my yard." He worked there 6 years, and she never told him. He found out much later from somebody else and had to go stand out by the trucks for a while. Beckert Cedar closed 2021 at $250,000. Down from 2019. Down hard because of the debt service and the yard lease and 22 truckloads of inventory sitting on the books. Corinne kept saying it like it was a number to apologize for. And Ruth Ann kept saying no. Because look at it. 12 years earlier there had been a woman, with $40, a cracked windshield, and a pile of garbage on the ground, where her fence used to be. $250,000. Out of the same wood. The exact same wood, because those billets came out of the same yard the scrap came out of, off the same logs, cut from the same stands of eastern red cedar growing in the same limestone dirt in the same county. 12 years of them paying to throw it at her. And then she bought the rest. She stepped back from the floor in 2024. Tessa Yarbrough ran operations. 22 employees. 4 states for the wholesale line. And Ruth Ann Beckert, 78 years old, went and did something she had been thinking about since a Thursday night in 2013 and had never said out loud to one living soul. She called the community college. Dr. Imani Ofori was still there, 60 by then. Same reading glasses on the same chain. Still standing very still while she talked. And when Ruth Ann said her name on the phone, there was a pause, and then Dr. Ofori said, 34 pages. Ruth Ann said, "You remember that?" And Dr. Ofori said, "Mrs. Beckert, do you know how many students I have had in 26 years who turned in 34 pages? Beat 2. She taught 1 evening a month. Same room. Second row was where she'd sat, and she made a point of walking past it. 19 students, most of them 19 years old, 3 or 4 of them past 50, and sitting near the back, with their arms folded like they were waiting to be embarrassed. And on the first night of every session, before she said anything at all, Ruth Ann Beckert walked down the rows with a coffee can and put 2 pieces of wood in every set of hands. 1 raw, 1 finished, and she said, "Smell them." And then she waited, because it takes them a second. It always took them a second. They'd go for the pretty one first. They always went for the pretty one first, the honey-colored one, the one that looked like money, and get nothing much. and then the plain one. And the room would change. 19 faces all at once going somewhere else. To a grandmother's landing. To a box in an attic. To a coat that isn't there anymore. And then she'd say it. The same way every time. Standing at the front of a community college classroom in Caldwell County, Tennessee, 78 years old. Holding a piece of scrap. The pretty one is sealed. It still smells. It'll still smell in the spring. And by next winter it'll be nothing but wood, and it will not save one single thing you own. The plain one will still be working in 40 years. Pause. That's the whole lesson. That's all I've got. The thing that makes it worth something is the thing you were about to cover up. She'd let that sit. And then most nights she'd add one more. Not planned. It just came out the first time in front of 19 strangers, and after that she couldn't leave it out. She'd say, "They didn't throw that wood away because it was worthless. They threw it away because nobody had looked at it close enough yet. People are the same." She taught that class for 4 years. And on the last night of the last session, in the spring, she stayed after to stack the folding chairs because she had always stayed after to stack the folding chairs. Corinne was waiting in the parking lot with the car running. And when Ruth Ann came out and got in, her daughter said, "How was it?" And Ruth Ann Beckert, 82 years old, sat in the passenger seat with a coffee can of cedar scraps in her lap. And she said, "They all went for the pretty one first. They always do." Then she looked out the window at a community college parking lot in Caldwell County, Tennessee, where a woman with $40 and a dead husband had once come on Tuesday evenings because her kitchen was too quiet. And she said, "Take me home, honey. I want to open the closet." This is a work of fiction. Caldwell County, Marlow Bend, the Cavanaugh Pencil Company, Beckert Cedar, and every person in this story are invented. Any resemblance to real companies or people is coincidental. The properties of eastern red cedar described here are real.